is not an attempt by me to in any way control your life from the grave, but while I'm still of sound mind somewhat, I'd like to pass on to you some truths that I've learned in my life that I hope might be helpful to you to make your life easier and more pleasant, more fulfilling, and happier. I suppose we all intellectually know that one day we're going to die, that this life is not forever, it's terminal, and there is death in everybody's life. When you're young, that's intellectually you know that, but it doesn't become real until you're further along in life, and when you spend more time thinking about the here and after than you do about the here and now. I want to pass on to you some things that have happened in my life that show that God is in control. I guess the theme of this little tape would be that God has a plan for your life, and that if it's followed, it will make your life a lot more pleasant and a lot happier, will relieve you of a lot of burdens and pain that otherwise might be there. You know, when I was young, probably 11 or 12 years old, my dad preached the greatest sermon that I've ever heard. He took me out into the Bower community, and we walked across a field to an old family cemetery that was over there. I don't know who the people were. I don't know a lot about the background, but there was a grave there of a Mr. Walker who died many, many years ago. The cemetery was grown up in weeds and vines, but Daddy pulled back those vines and weeds so that I could read the inscription on old Mr. Walker's tombstone. And here's what it said: "Remember, friends, as you pass by, as you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you must be. Prepare for death and follow me." From that day until this day, that inscription has been burned into my memory. My dad pointed out that the truth that contained, and as I said earlier, I don't think I've ever had a sermon, Billy Graham or anybody else has preached a sermon that has stuck in my mind. So, of course, at that time I thought it was funny and strange, and I even years after that took my friends out there and showed it to them, and we all thought it was rather humorous. But as I grow older and as I've thought about it, and as I've reviewed that inscription so many times, the truth of that sinks in very deeply. It's been burned into my memory. God has a plan for your life, and if you follow it, there are good things and happiness in store. Now, how do you follow that? How do you know that plan? It's not going to be with a bolt of lightning or a burning bush or whatever, but it's revealed day to day in prayer, Bible study, and in corporate worship, where you're around other Christians and pastors that break the word out in ways that you can understand. And if you pray about it daily, God has a way of revealing things to you as to what He has in store for you in your life. You know, when I was very small, my grandmother King was determined that I would be a doctor, a surgeon. And she used to tell me that surgeons needed long, thin fingers to operate in such delicate areas. and she spent hours and hours pulling on my little stubby fingers, trying to make them grow long so I could be a doctor. But I grew up during the Second World War, and where kids in previous generations and even after played cowboys and Indians, and that was fun. In my time, we played war. There was a Dyersburg Air Base was built down near Halls, and that's where B-17 crews came together, and they practiced here for a couple, 3 months before they flew these airplanes from Dyersburg, Tennessee to England and participated in the bombing raids in Europe and so forth. I got to know a number of those pilots out there very well. Our family did. We even rented a room, and some of them stayed with us and during the time they were here. The greatest thrill I had back then was when some of those pilots would take me out to the air base and let me climb into one of those B-17s and sit in the pilot's seat for a while. I thought that was the ultimate. Those men were my heroes. We followed them through the war, and even after the war, kept up with their families and so forth, and I got to know them very well. Some were killed in action. I also observed that the ones that had the greatest respect, that seemed to be a cut above everybody else, were the ones that had been to West Point and the military academy, and had grown up in that environment, and therefore were much better equipped as leaders and pilots and so forth. I also knew that these were bomber crews, and they were heroes, but I knew too that the really cream of the crop, the ones that had done best in their pilot training, were sent to fighters. So during that time, my lifelong goal became to become a fighter pilot. I thought that was the ultimate. And I also wanted to go to one of the military academies to prepare me for that, because I saw how superior I thought those individuals were when they were here. I prayed about that a lot. God blessed me in that I was able to go to the Naval Academy and later get into the Air Force. You know, God blessed me in so many ways. I had wonderful parents. I grew up in a family environment with grandparents and aunts and uncles, and all of them loved me and nourished me and disciplined me and taught me the work ethic, how important it was to do your share in the family. And I think I was probably the best prepared of anybody. God had given me a sound body, He had given me a sound mind, and had given me that background of parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles that raised me and loved me and nourished me and taught me the lessons of life that I needed. But you know, going through school, I always did well in academics, but I was never at the top of the class. I was never the valedictorian. I love sports, and I played in just about every sport that came along, and some well enough to be on the team and get a lot of playing time, but I never was the star. I never felt that I excelled in sports. I never felt that I excelled academically. At the Naval Academy, I was in some pretty tough competition with people. Even some of those had graduated from college, but yet I was able to maintain my position there well enough that I was able to have a very high preference number. We had 742 people in my class, and my preference number was 125. And that didn't only take into consider academics, but in other activities, leadership and so forth. So as it turned out, with my preference number and my physical, I could have taken anything, any assignment that was available. And I selected the Air Force, commissioned in the Air Force. At that time, there was no Air Force Academy, and 25% from West Point and 25% from the Naval Academy could volunteer each year to go into the Air Force, and that's what I did. I selected the Air Force because I felt like they had the better aircraft. They were more oriented toward aviation. In the Navy, what we call the Black Shoe Navy, or the surface Navy, was still in the senior positions in the Naval Service. And although you could fly, you could become a Navy pilot, but you also had to serve your time on surface ships and be qualified as officer of the deck and all those things before you could be promoted. Aviation was sort of a secondary career or a hobby. I wanted a career in aviation, and that's the reason I selected the Air Force. I was fortunate enough to be able to graduate high enough in my class that I could get the preference numbers to go to fighters. As I said earlier, I never was the tops in academics, and there was the top in sports. But when I got into aviation, I felt like that I was the best. I don't say that in the way of bragging, but simply to show how great God is and how He prepared me for those things. You know, in the fighter squadrons that I was in, there was a definite pecking order. It was not as Hollywood as Top Gun and that kind of thing, but nevertheless, there was a pecking order. And every time a new man came into the squadron, it didn't take long for us to place him in the proper position, whether he was the best or the worst or where he fit in. In the 3 different fighter squadrons I was in, I felt like that if I wasn't the very top, I was certainly in the top few. God blessed that in a way that I was selected to be the aide to General Shores. Probably the greatest opportunity that I could have in the Air Force. I learned, he treated me like a son. I can't tell you how much I learned under his tutorship and how I understood how the Air Force operated and the staff positions and the things that had to be done. And he gave me responsibilities that far exceeded my rank in the Air Force. I had responsibilities that were ordinarily reserved for lieutenant colonels and colonels. He really had a lot of confidence in me and trust. And as I flew with other people, I felt like that I was the best, and I was considered the best. I know that he had a great deal of confidence in me, and we flew in weather and took off in weather that were really by regulations too low, and the fields were closed because of weather. But because he was an air defense commander, he had the authority to waive those restrictions and allow us to fly. And he had the confidence in me that we could do those things. And we did some things that very few people have undertaken at that time in aviation. And again, I don't say that as a bragging about, hey, look at me, but I say that as, hey, look what God did in my career. I think I could have gone to any school, had any assignment, could have done anything I wanted to do. My future in the Air Force was secure, and I had a jump on my contemporaries that was unbelievable. The future for me as an Air Force career officer was unlimited. But you know, as happy as I was, and as much as I enjoyed that, and as much as I felt like I could do anything I wanted to in the Air Force, there was still a heaviness in my heart, a thing that I knew was not exactly right. I knew very well that Tommy was not happy in that nomadic life. It was not an environment that I wanted to raise Kathy and Mike in, and I knew there were great separations in store for me in a career, family separations, and it was a burden to me. I can't tell you how miraculous it was, how the doors opened and doors closed, and how it worked out that I should come back to Dyersburg for the job in the bank. That was the furthest thing from my mind, and yet I had a confidence about that. I had a peace of heart about that. It was not an easy decision. I was leaving the Air Force where my career was on the verge of blossoming. I came to a job that paid about half of what I was making in the Air Force. I gave up medical benefits, retirement program, and all those kind of things to come back and work in the bank. And although those were concerns that I thought about, I had a peace of mind, and I knew, because of the doors that had been opened and the ones that had been closed, that was the thing God wanted me to do. I questioned many times then and since then why He blessed me so in that Air Force career and blessed me so in my ability as a fighter pilot. Why He would do that and yet have other plans for me. And I guess it's almost like my 40 years wandering in the desert. I just wasn't ready to accept that on a step of faith, and I think I learned things in the military that were useful to me, and I think I matured in a way that was very good, and I don't think I would have been able to make that move otherwise. I didn't know a debit from a credit. My degree was in engineering, and I had never taken any accounting courses or anything like that, and it was an unknown field. But again, God blessed me and made it so that I moved rather rapidly, and the financial issues went away, and I had finally picked up pretty good medical benefits and a retirement program and so forth that took care of all those concerns that I had, but that I stepped out on faith to God. I had several more opportunities in the banking industry to move to better paying jobs in different places. Some were very attractive. Financially, they were attractive, but I never felt that that's what I should do. I never felt that God had intended for me to make those moves. I just, my heart wasn't in the same place that it was when I made the decision to leave the Air Force. That's strange, but that's the way it was. God has always taken care of us. You can't outgive God. And just very candidly, when we left the Air Force and came back to the bank, I'll admit freely that I thought, if I have to, I'll cut down on my tithe, and that way we'll be able to provide for the family. The same situation when Kathy and Mike were going to college. I prepared and saved money ahead of time, but I have to admit that I thought more times than one, if I really get in a bind, surely God will excuse me if I cut down on the tithe for their college work. My mother taught me to tithe when I was just a kid, and when I was getting 10 cents allowance or 25 cents allowance a week, she always told me that a tenth of that was God's, and I always honored that and put that tenth into the offering plate on Sunday. It was a lesson that I never forgot. But in all these times that those sinful thoughts were running through my mind, God took care of that. We never had a need that wasn't met. We're able to send Kathy and Mike through college, and I never had to use some of the investments that I had made when they were born to try to provide for that. Somehow the money was just always there. Somehow we were able to pay the tuitions. It was just phenomenal. It was almost like the 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. It was so little that as you divided it up and paid for things, it was just there. And I'll never forget that. And that was as much a miracle, I think, as walking on water. It just happened. But the reason I say that is it's not in a bragging way or to say, hey, look at me, what I did. It's to say to you, look what God did. He has provided for us in a way that's beyond comprehension. And it's been so very clear. The only time that I have felt that God wasn't around is when I left God. God didn't leave me. I just neglected my prayers and Bible study and communication with Him on a daily basis, and that's when you get into trouble. I know through my life I've had situations come up that I thought were insurmountable, and I've been very depressed and didn't know how to handle them. But after prayer and communicating with God, those things the problems just seemed to vanish. And what at one time seemed like it was insurmountable, it was just a very easy, simple thing to do. And the temptation is to say, oh, look what I did. I didn't even need God. I took care of that myself. But that's not right. God is the one that took care of those burdens and made that for us. I think at this age, you probably look back and as I said earlier, God gave me so much to begin with a sound body and mind and loving Christian parents, grandparents, and so forth, and an education, as fine an education as you can get anywhere. And I just wondered if I really did everything that I could have done. As I read an alumni magazine, I see classmates of mine that have done great things. I had a couple that were astronauts that walked on the moon. I have one that's chairman of General Dynamics, one that went into a bathysphere to the bottom of the ocean where nobody had ever been before and plotted the ocean floor, and on. There were great people. I have some that were ambassadors to different countries, advisors to the president, people that I knew on a personal, everyday basis. And yet I look and I think, well, I was as smart as they were. I had as much talent as they had. And the ones in the Air Force and the astronaut program, I was a better pilot than they were. And yet here I sit, I just wonder if I really did everything that God would have me do. And one day I was sitting out here on the porch doing my morning devotional and really laboring over those thoughts of how I probably let God down. And I was reading in the Bible, and suddenly it occurred to me about Abraham and how he was the father of a great nation. And he didn't do a lot of the things that Moses did. He didn't walk across the Red Sea, and he didn't make water come from a rock, and he didn't do all the miracles that people that followed him did. He didn't have great battles like David and so forth, that he was a king, but he was the father of a great nation. And it occurred to me that maybe God's plan for me, for old John Gauldin, was to be the father of a great family. I look at the wife that I had, a wonderful Christian lady that was my life partner, that helped me in every way, that raised our children. I look at our children that are healthy and smart and educated, and I look at their spouses, what wonderful Christian spouses they have. I look at my grandchildren and I think what wonderful, smart, capable grandchildren I have, and I just think there's no telling what this family can do and will do. And if somebody said, well, what would you like to be remembered for? Well, of course, probably from an ego standpoint, I'd like to think, well, I was one of the best fighter pilots that ever came through the Air Force. But that's not what really matters. What really matters, and what I'd like to be remembered for, and what I find peace with God in, that I raised my family in a way that they could accomplish the things that they have accomplished, and that they will be able to do great things. And so I really feel like that my calling in life was not to do a lot of the astronauts, the head of business and so forth, but it was to nourish and provide for a family, to be the father of a nation, so to speak. And I really expect that to happen. That's about all I have to say, and I say it at this time because I've never felt that I had the appropriate opportunity, or the occasion was never quite right to get down and admit these gut level things that I've said to you. Again, I want to emphasize that what I've said about being the best this or that and what I've done is not in a way to say, hey, look at old John, what he's done, but it's to show to you, or to point out to you, that this came from God. This came from trying to follow God's will. One time I was talking to Bob Agee, and when he was real sick and taking his chemo, and we talked about death, and I told Bob, I said, I'm not so worried about dying, but I am awful worried and concerned about facing God and trying to explain to him why I did so many things that I shouldn't have, and why I didn't do things that I should have, and explain to him the sins of my life. And he said to me, he said, John, he said, I think if you do that, you're going to find that God is saying, what are you talking about? All of that is gone, that the blood of Christ washed away your sins, and it's white as snow, and Jesus Christ paid for those sins with his blood on the cross, and that because of that, have no fear of facing God, because those sins are not even on the books anymore. They have been erased by the blood of Christ. What a comforting thought. One of my favorite verses in the Bible is in 2 Timothy, the 1st chapter, where Paul says to Timothy, I know whom I have believed, and I am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I've committed unto him against that day. And I am convinced of that. And that is a tremendous comforting thought. That, coupled with the fact that you can have your sins washed away by the blood of Christ, makes everything all right, and you face tomorrow with a degree of confidence. I do think more about the hereafter than I do the here and now, but it's with a degree of confidence that I do that. I'm not afraid of dying. I'm not afraid to face God. I am afraid that I'll have suffering and pain here before that time, but sure, that'll be a short thing and not lasting. But the most important thing is eternity. I love all of you so much. I love my wife. I love Kathy and Mike. I love Melissa and James, and I love the grandchildren with all my heart. And what I want for you is for you to have a happy and wonderful life. And I hope that what I've said to you will encourage you to stay close to God, to pray daily, to read the Bible daily, to attend every time you get a worship service or association with Christians. Do that, because by daily prayer and so forth, that's the way God speaks to you. And not in this day and time does he write it in stone or through a lightning flash or burning bush, but he does it day by day in answer to your prayers as you speak to him, and he in turn, in the quietness of that time, speaks to you. That's all I have to say. I love you all very, very much, and if God permits us to know what's going on here on earth after death, you can bet that I'll be right there beside you and watching everything that you do. Again, I love you, and I thank you for letting me speak to you in this way.